So that is a video from one of our partners, Venture, that we partner with every year. And yesterday, a whole bunch of women run for her, and raised tens of thousands of dollars for Venture, which is so awesome. Yeah. So huge shout out to those of you who ran, to those of you who were a part of that event. Man, just a huge shout out to you. For those of you that donated and gave to that, thanks for your generosity. And between that and Fathers for the Fatherless, those are two events that we do each year that really help us to be able to be generous with what God's entrusted to us. But you might think this, well, but I don't run, I don't ride a bike, well, what's my part? Those are just two small things that we do in the grand scheme of everything. And so those are a couple of events, but all year long, there's all kinds of opportunities to give and be a part of, and you guys partner in so many different ways. So we're just so thankful to be part of such a generous church. I never want to miss a chance to say thanks for your generosity, and so we just want to highlight this from time to time and let you know, here's what your generosity is doing. So thanks for being such an incredibly generous church. My name's Jeremiah. I'm one of the pastors here, and I just want to say, if we've never met before, I'd love for you to come say hi afterwards. I want to say hello to those of you joining us online. If you're in a parent viewing room, great option if you have small kids you prefer to keep with you during the service. And I want to let you know this before we jump into the talk today. A couple quick things. Reminder, next week, online only. And not only is it an online-only service, it'll be a little bit of an abbreviated service. So check that out. And then we come back in 2 weeks with new service times. So you're going to have to lock this in. It's not going to be at this time. It's going to be 9 and 10:30. That's our summer schedule. And then we'll do that just through the summer. Don't get too used to that. We're going back to 3, potentially 4 services in the fall. And so just for the summer, as people are kind of traveling, we'll go down to 2 services this summer. So 9 and 10:30 starts in 2 weeks. And then, real quick, if you have ever been like in a service and you look up on stage and you see these musicians and you're just like in awe of their talent and you're just sitting there going, man, I know I can shred like those guys, then you should join. And the way to do that, we have auditions this afternoon at 4:30. So just come here to the church at 4:30, bring your axe, okay, bring your vocals, bring your drumsticks, bring your BS, and show us what you got. And we'd love, if you're a musician, if you're a singer, like, we would love for you to join this group of people. And it's a group of people who volunteer their time and go, man, I've got some talents that God's given me and I want to use those. So if you're interested in that, auditions are today at 4:30. Love to have you participate in that. Now, we're wrapping up a series today. This is sort of, kind of wrapping up the school year, wrapping up a series. We've been in a series called The Road Less Stupid. And it's been a really great series, practical wisdom in every sort of area of our life. And the reason for this is, as we look back at our own lives, we know that we all have some things in common. We have words we wish we hadn't said. And we have things we wish we hadn't done. And we have invitations we wish we hadn't accepted. And money we wish we hadn't spent. And we can wish that we could go back and unlive or redo some of those things. And the reality is we can't. But we do have the opportunity to acquire and apply wisdom moving forward. In fact, one of the ways that we do that, and really the foundation through this whole series and the foundation for really acquiring and applying wisdom in our life, it comes from this verse found in Proverbs. Solomon writes this nearly 3,000 years ago. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you want to know where wisdom begins, it is an acknowledgement that God is God and I'm not. It's an acknowledgement of God's position in the universe and consequently my position in the universe in relation to that. And so it's recognizing, man, there is an author of life. And if there is an author of life, it's possible his way of living life is better than my way of living life. That if I submit to his way, my life will actually flourish. And we genuinely believe this, and Scripture backs this up, that God wants our lives to flourish, that God isn't some cosmic killjoy waiting for us to screw up, right? So he can strike us with lightning, but he actually wants our lives to flourish. He wants us to live the best life possible. So over this series, we've talked about marriage and friendships and finances and the workplace and parenting and all kinds of these big areas of life. And today, we're going to talk about wisdom for our time. Wisdom for our time. Now, here's why this matters, okay? It's because wise people are proactive with their time. If you want to acquire wisdom, if you want to apply wisdom in your life, that means you are proactive with your time instead of reactive, right? Now, how many of you have ever played Bop It? It's a great game. I'm a big fan.
Bop it to start.
We're going to try it right here. You ready? See what we can do.
33. Bop it. Twist it. Pull it. 10.
That's new.
Bop it. Hammer it. Twist it. Drink it. Pull it. Hammer it. Selfie it. Hammer it. Hammer it. Pull it. Selfie it. Drink it. Hammer it.
There's a lot of actions.
Drink it. Selfie it.
Oh, I didn't selfie it in time. Okay, so you get the idea, right? We've all played this game before. All right, now this thing is gonna go off. It doesn't know how to turn itself off. We had this happen last service.
Bop it like you mean it. Score 0.
Now it will turn itself off, hopefully. It might have one more comment for me here, so. But this is the game of bop it, right? Is pull it, bop it, twist it. These got some new actions. Hammer it, selfie it, drink it. I'm like, where in the world? This is like the next generation of bop it, right? But here's the point, is that everything about the bop it game is reactive. You have to constantly be in the moment and react and react and react and react. And unfortunately for some of us,
I'm going to sleep.
good night, bop it. Unfortunately for many of us, we end up living our lives that way, where it's like we're constantly just reacting to what's coming next. And it's not on purpose, it's not intentional, but we cram our schedules so full, there's no margin in our time. We have this hurry sickness in our culture, and we're living our lives simply trying to keep up with all of the demands that are on us, and all of our schedules, and our kids' schedules, and the places we need to be, and the things we need to do, and the things we're responsible for. And what ends up happening is that we are unintentionally living lives that are reactive and not proactive. And here's what happens. Then time goes by, and another year passes, and another decade passes, and we're not any closer to the kind of life we want to live. But I heard this from this phrase this last year when I was in a coaching thing with a group of pastors, and one of them said, "You are ridiculously in charge of your own life." Like, wow, that's actually true. So this is a little exercise to help us kind of see the hurry sickness that we sometimes suffer from. And you can participate if you're watching online. Just put an exclamation point in the chat. I've cut through a gas station parking lot to avoid stopping at a red light. Lift your hand if that applies to you. Definitely right here. How about this? I don't like to take vacations when there isn't something to do. Anybody? You're just like, come on, what? We're just sitting in a lawn chair all day? Come on, we gotta go. How about this? I frequently look at my phone for no reason. Anybody have that disease? Or phantom vibrations? I think no, okay. How about this? Tell me if this is you. I often switch lines because I think the one I'm in is too slow. And then what do we do, right? I believe God makes whatever line I'm in the slowest. Anybody? Yeah. I will switch lines. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'll switch lines. But maybe this is just me, but then I will keep track of where I would have been in that line. And then I'm like racing myself of my previous position. And I'm like, oh, if I would have stayed, I would actually be further. And like, God, you're doing this to me, you know? How about this? I often can't sleep even though I'm tired because my mind can't shut off. Anybody? How about this? People who talk slowly irritate me. I'll tell you who irritates me. Anybody who listens to a podcast on regular speed. Like, guys, there's a button, 2 times speed, 3 times speed, like you can speed this up. I can't even listen to a podcast on regular speed anymore. I'm just like conditioned to 2 times to 3 times speed. I'm like, get me through this 40-minute podcast in 17 minutes, you know? That might be a problem. Now, I understand why most of us lived these jam-packed lives. A little bit of it's FOMO, right? It's the fear of missing out. We see the highlight reel of everybody else's life on social media, and we look at our boring lives and think, I need to do more. I should be out there. I should be doing more. I should be accomplishing more. And party here, vacation there. I got to try that new thing. My kids should be participating in that. And life is always reminding us what we're missing out on, isn't it? And beach vacations, blemish-free skin, muscles, energy, an invitation, followers, friends, a date, romance, happiness, purpose. And our constant angst keeps us from being able to just truly live and breathe and experience contentment because we're kind of living that bop it life, aren't we? Just always reacting to the next thing, chasing the next thing, and pretty much time just goes by. And consequently, it has a huge effect on the way that we spend our time. And unfortunately, we are suffering the consequences. And yet, here's what we know intuitively. We would say this: time is the most valuable asset in your life. It's the most valuable asset in my life. We know this when we talk about it. We use words like financial language to talk about our time. We say things like spending our time or investing our time or wasting time. We actually do believe our time is our most valuable asset. And here's how I know this, and maybe you've never put it in these terms, but this is kind of an interesting thought. At the end of my life and at the end of your life, many of us are going to spend a lot of money trying to buy more time. Maybe you've experienced that with a loved one or a family member or a friend. That somebody, maybe you, or maybe another family member or a loved one or a friend has spent a lot of money because someone in their family, someone that they were close to, they spent money trying to buy more time. And so consequently, this is what we know sort of intuitively, and maybe we've never put it in these terms before, but our time is our most valuable asset. And that's how valuable time is to us. In fact, when you think about it, you could actually put it like this. How you spend your time is how you spend your life. However you spend your time is how you spend your life. Your time equals your life. And so regardless of how much money you have or how much success you have or how much you accumulate or how much you acquire or how many friends or followers you have, however you spend every second of your life, however you spend your time is how you're spending your life. And that's a sobering thought. That immediately causes us to take stock and evaluate, okay, how am I really spending my time? Because that is your life. In the 1960s, Time magazine did an article on a report that came out about time management. And an expert testimony was brought in to talk to a subcommittee of the Senate. And the report was basically, they said, because of advances in technology, in about 20 years, now this is the 1960s, they said in about 20 years, because of the advances in technology, people are gonna have to work less hours and probably work fewer weeks out of the year and probably retire a lot earlier. And the big problem, it was reported, would be this. What would people do with all of their free time? Isn't that amazing? Like we look back and we go, man, feels like in the 60s, 50s, like it feels like, 50, 60, 70 years ago, people had a lot of free time. And we're going, man, we're just jam-packed. They used to sit around a radio and listen to a radio station together in the living room. And they're looking forward going, man, those people in the future are gonna have so much time on their hands. And yet, what's true for all of us? We all wish we had a little more time, right? How many times have we thought this? Man, I wish there were 8 days in a week. I wish there were 9 days. I wish there were 26 hours in a day and 8 days in a week, 13 months in the year. It's just I need a little bit more time to do everything. And that's the common problem. We all want more time. And when we don't manage our time well, we don't manage it with wisdom, we end up with very little margin. And when we don't manage time well and be proactive about it, and we tend to just react to whatever life throws at us, we end up with very, very little margin in our lives. And what happens is it has a very negative impact on different areas of our life. It has a negative impact on our personal life. Our personal life suffers. We become the people that we don't want to become. Think about this for a second. When we run our lives at breakneck speed, it sucks the joy out of our lives, doesn't it? I can't tell you how many times I've raised my voice at my kids, and it wasn't even anything that they did. It was just because I had no margin. I was stressed because of my schedule, because I said yes to too many things, and I didn't manage my time better, and they got the relational shrapnel, what I was dealing with internally. How many of you would admit, just quick show of hands, sometimes you deal with that flash flood anger? Just pops up, and you're like, man, where did that come from, right? How about addiction to speed? Yeah, addiction to speed. That's a huge one. I suffer from this, right? Like, was my hand the first one? Okay. For some of you, your schedule was so crammed that if your neighbors would have seen you leaving the house today to go to church, they would have thought there was an evacuation happening. They're like, oh man, they got out of there in a hurry. I hope their house isn't on fire, And you guys, as a family, right, you jumped in the car, you're like, we're late, right? There's just no margin ever, and you ran through a yellow light to get here, right? And showed up 15 minutes late and thought, man, I wish this church did music. And when I feel rushed, when there's no margin in my schedule, I tend to make poor decisions. I tend to treat people poorly. Have you ever noticed it's difficult to be kind to someone who's kind of messing with the pace of your schedule? You get kind of irritated when people are moving at a slower pace than you. And part of that is because you shouldn't be moving at that fast of a pace anyways, but you haven't left yourself any margin, so you got to get to all the stuff. And then there's that one person who's just wandering in the left lane. And because of where you're at, you're like, you give yourself permission to treat them poorly. And our hurry sickness in the United States has led us to a new low in areas of compassion and kindness. And after a while, it starts to affect us on the inside. We become, negative, less compassionate, less patient versions of ourselves than we want to be. But oftentimes, those are just symptoms of a schedule out of control. Have you ever noticed this? I'm rarely impressed with the busyness of others, but I often hope they're impressed with mine. What is that? It's just hurry sickness. And so poor time management is really impacting our personal life, and it starts to impact in a negative way our relational life, because it's our relationships that tend to suffer. We have less time to spend with our kids or our spouse. The time we do spend, we aren't present. We're physically present but mentally absent. When we don't learn to manage our time, we treat each moment as the gift that it is. Then what ends up happening is we give ourselves permission to lose patience with other people. We give ourselves permission and we blame it on them. Well, they're in my way, they're slower, it's their fault. And we treat people as less than because they're holding us up. We stop seeing them the way that God sees them, as a child of His, created in His image. And when we don't manage our time well, we spend our time in the areas of life that feel really urgent, but they're probably not all that important. And we give our focus and our attention and our energy to the tyranny of the urgent. And we miss out on a lot of things that are really important, particularly relationships. It causes us to be stressed and fatigued and lose out on relationships that are truly important. And eventually, it starts to really impact our spiritual life. Because I don't think any of us intentionally neglect our relationship with God, our spiritual life, but when we don't manage our time well, God begins to feel distant. And we don't have any time, any emotional energy to sit down and reflect on how God wants us to grow, allow God to speak to us and lead us into our next right step, then we're too busy. And over time, our attention turns towards ourselves. Anytime that we're so busy that our spiritual life starts to suffer, the natural consequence of that is that we just naturally start to think about us more. We start to turn inward more and more. And yet the great paradox of life is that life is all about discovering how much God loves you and giving your life away in service to others. But that's really difficult to do when you're focused on you. And this causes us to do that. And the truth is, we could argue it's just our culture. We just live in the 21st century in the United States of America, and this is part of the hurry sickness that we all suffer from because of social media and just the pace of life. And yet, Job writes this almost 3,000 years ago. My days are swifter than a runner. They fly away without a glimpse of joy. Anybody relate to that? Man, it feels like time is just flying by, and it's just like my days just go by so quickly. Solomon would write this almost 3,000 years ago. It's better to have only a little with peace of mind than be busy all the time with both hands trying to catch the wind. Anybody feel like you're trying to catch the wind sometimes with your schedule? Like, better to have peace of mind, Solomon says, than to constantly be on the go, so busy that you're trying to catch the wind. And contrary to what we might think, seems the struggle to manage our time well is not a 21st century issue or an American issue. It seems like it's a human issue. And if you're a follower of Jesus, or if you're with us here today and you're exploring following Jesus, I think it's a really important question to ask. How does God see our time? How does He view it, the time that we've been given? And what if we could spend our time, spend our lives in a way that is in sync with how God created the world to operate? Now, you may not even be a church person or a Jesus follower, and maybe you're just exploring faith, but here's what I can tell you. You and I are not the first people to wrestle with this idea, to think through the concept of time, and we won't be the last. And this collection of documents called the Scriptures, called the Bible, there's a lot of practical wisdom in the Scriptures as it relates to our time if we'll open our minds, open our hearts to receive it. And to help us understand that question, how does God view our time? Well, we're going to look at something that was written by Moses several thousand years ago. Now, if you're not familiar with Moses, think Prince of Egypt, right? Moses was the guy that he was a Jewish guy who was found by the daughter of Pharaoh, and the Hebrew people, the nation of Israel, were slaves in Egypt. But Moses somehow was found, and he was sort of rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. And so he becomes the grandson of Pharaoh. So even though he's Jewish, even though he's Hebrew, he grows up in Pharaoh's household. He grows up in the palace. He grows up with privilege and wealth and royalty. And then at about 40 years old, he realizes, okay, I don't want to do this anymore because I'm actually Hebrew, and the nation of Israel, my Hebrew brothers and sisters are all slaves. And so rather than continue to be in the palace, he tries to do something about it and ends up getting him expelled from Egypt. He spends the next 40 years as a shepherd, alone in the wilderness, thinking, well, I tried, this is how I'm gonna live out my days. And after 40 years in the wilderness being a shepherd, then God brings him back to Egypt, and he leads the nation of Israel out of Egypt, out of slavery, and then he spends another 40 years leading the nation of Israel until eventually they get into the promised land. And so you think about this, he lives like 4 different lifetimes really, right? Just amazing. And so if anybody has perspective on time, it's Moses. And Moses writes a psalm. A lot of times we think about the Psalms written by King David. There's a few other authors in the Psalms. This one is written by Moses. And because the language can be a little poetic, I'm gonna give you the bottom line and then we're gonna dig this out together. The bottom line is this: we discover purpose through context. We discover the purpose of something when it's connected to a larger context. When something's not connected to a larger context, it's difficult to understand the purpose of it. When it comes to how we spend our lives, how we spend our time, context is everything. And in order to see your life, in order to see your time correctly, you have to see it in its proper context. Think about it like this. Have you ever opened up a drawer at your house and there's like 13 different chargers in there? And you're like, what is this? You pull one of them out, you're like, does anybody know what this is? You know what that is? That's a question of purpose. It's a purpose question. Hey, why does this exist? What is it for? What is it here for? Right? And then one of your kids or your roommate or your spouse, they come along and they go, oh, that is the charger to my tablet. I have been looking for that. Thank you very much. And then they take it away and you're like, oh, context provides purpose. I had no idea what this was for. Obviously it charges something, but we don't know what it is. And then when the context comes along, it's like, okay, now there's purpose for this thing. Otherwise, we're going to toss it, right? There's no purpose for it. But you always find the purpose of something based on its context. And this is what Moses would tell us, is that you want to know the purpose of your life, then you got to understand the context. That's a purpose question. What is it here for? And so when we think about our own lives, we think about our time. Why do we exist? What are we here for? Right? Well, what is this for? The answer to all those questions is context. Once someone tells you what that charger does and what it's for, it takes on purpose because it's connected to something else. And so in the psalm we're going to read together, Moses says, okay, if you want to know purpose, if you want to know why you exist, if you want to know what your time should be used for, how to view your time, how to view your life, then you've got to understand the context in which you live, in which your whole life takes on its purpose. So here's what he writes in Psalm 90, and we're going to walk through this psalm together. He says, Lord, through all the generations, you have been our home. Lord, through all the generations, you have been our home. So he's talking in the context of a nation of Israel that's been a nation for hundreds of years, but they've never actually had a home. They've never had a home base. They've been in slavery. They've been wandering around the wilderness. They're a nomadic people. And he goes, we've been a nation for hundreds of years. We've never had a home, but God, you've been our home. Wherever you are, that's where home is. We find our identity, we find our security, we find all of that in you. And then he continues in the next verse, and he says, before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So here's what Moses would say. When you think about a timeline, if you were to go eternity that direction and eternity that direction, from everlasting to everlasting, God, you have always been and you will always be. God has no beginning and no end. God's eternal existence is the context in which we find our lives, our existence. Wherever you are born and whenever you are born within the context of a God who was here before we were and will be here after we're gone. From eternity to eternity, from everlasting to everlasting. God, we find our lives in the context of your greater story. And then he says this is sort of fascinating. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. It's the most Gandalf thing you're ever going to read in the Bible, man. It's like, what is happening here? But again, this is poetic, and he's drawing the contrast. He's using hyperbole to draw the contrast between our mortal lives and God's eternal existence. This is a statement that emphasizes the one that comes before it. And so he says, look, you're from everlasting to everlasting. We are dust, but you are infinite. You are eternal. And then to emphasize that even more, he continues. He says, for you, 1,000 years are as a passing day, as brief as a few night hours. He says, man, for us, God, 1,000 years go by, and for you, it's like a day. In fact, it's shorter than that. It's like just a few hours. It's like an afternoon. Our lifetimes are like a little blip on the radar. Our whole entire lifetime, for you, 1,000 years goes by. And that would seem to us like an afternoon. That's the imagery that Moses is drawing. He's saying, God, because you were everlasting to everlasting, because you always have been and always will be, you don't operate in time the way that we do. Because we are finite and you are infinite. So our life here on earth it's temporary. So we understand that. And then he continues in the next verse and he says, you sweep people away like dreams that disappear. They're like grass that springs up in the morning. In the morning it blooms and flourishes, but by evening it is dry and withered. Moses says, I'm going to use this another illustration just to emphasize how short our lives are. I mean, you can plant fresh sod in the morning, and it can already be withered by the evening, and that's what our lives are like in the context of an eternally existing God. James, the brother of Jesus, would at one point write this: our life is like a mist. It's like a fog. It's here, and then it's gone. You ever been driving, and there's a fog, and you're like, man, it's foggy out, and then, by the time you get to work, or by the time you get to where you're going, the fog is already lifted? And James goes, that's what our life is like in the context of a God who is from everlasting to everlasting. By comparison, our lives are very short. We don't even need Moses to tell us that. We don't need James, the brother of Jesus, to tell us that, because Facebook Memories tells us that. Right? How many times does that sucker pop up in your feed and you're just like, it says, hey, 10 years ago, check that out. And you're like, oh my gosh, I remember that like it was yesterday. That was 10 years ago? Man, holy cow, I'm getting old. We all have these, right? You've heard people say time goes faster the older that you get. That's not just an emotion. It's a scientific phenomenon. And isn't it interesting that when you're a kid, it feels like you're waiting forever for Christmas? Every second. When is Christmas going to get here? Oh, Christmas, I'm waiting. And then what happens? When you get older, it feels like it's Christmas every time you turn around. It's like, oh my gosh, is it Christmas again already? Holy cow. It's crazy, isn't it? Because when you hit a certain age, you stop thinking in terms of how old you are, and you start to think in terms of how much time you have left. That's a sobering thought. You're like, wow, I'm so glad I came for this depressing message. If our life is just like the grass that withers in a day, if we're like a mist, if we're like a fog that's here and then it's gone, then what is the point? And that is exactly the question that we should be asking. That is the question. That's a question about purpose. What is the point? Why are we here? If it's so short, what is the point? And that is a question about purpose, and purpose is connected to context. And Moses is saying if we're not careful, we can miss out on what the purpose is connected to. In fact, a couple verses later, he gives us a picture of what a life disconnected from purpose would look like. So he says this. He says 70 years are given to us, right? This is a broad generalization, right? He's going on average, right? 70 years are given to us. Some even live to 80. But even the best years are filled with pain and trouble. Soon they disappear and we fly away. This is him going, man, it's a description of a life that's wasted. 70, 80 years. It's a description of a life where they never figured out the context. Well, what is this life for? Well, what am I here for? And Moses turns the corner and says, there's something that if we knew it, if we understood it, there is a context, there is a picture, there is something that if we knew it, if we understood it, if we could see it, it would be the context that answers the question of purpose in every single one of our lives. And so this is what he would say. He would say, if only we knew the power of your anger. He's talking about God. Your wrath is as awesome as the fear you deserve. Again, right? Hyperbole. You're like, wow, what a great memory verse. Oh, put that on the mirror and read it each day, But here's the reality. Again, this is poetic. So Moses is using hyperbole. He's using exaggeration to get the point across. And the main contrast that Moses is making is between an everlasting God and mortal human beings. So here's literally what he's saying. Here's what this verse says in our context. He's saying this. If we could see God in all of his power, if we could see how vast God is, if we could see how big God is, if we could see just how huge God is, if we could see God the way that God really is, we would give him the reverence he's due. It would give us so much context to our lives. See, this is why we gather on, the weekends here and we sing songs together. Like, what is that all about? Maybe you've been wondering, like, I don't know, they do like a little concert every week. I don't know what's going on there. And here's what that is. This is about helping us to see God in his proper context. So we sing these songs that are prayers set to music, and the lyrics are very intentional to remind us of the vastness of God. When we come in and we sing, it's like, well, I got my problems during the week, and you got your problems during the week, and we're all kind of dealing with all the stuff, and we're spending our time and spending our life. But when we come in here, it's like we go, okay, for this moment in time, we're going to pause all of that, and we're going to shift our perspective away from us, and we're going to shift our perspective to an everlasting God, to an eternal God. We're going to remind ourselves that he is big, and he is vast, and he is incredible. We're going to remind ourselves how big his grace is. We're going to remind ourselves that he pursues us. We're going to remind ourselves of all of these attributes and characteristics of this eternally existing God. And the hope is that as we do that, it sort of resyncs, gives us the context for our lives. Oh yeah, all that stuff that I deal with, man, maybe I should spend my time a little bit differently in light of how big God is. And this is what Moses is saying. It's like, God, if we saw you, if we could really open our eyes and see you the way you really are, we would give you the reverence you're due. And it would provide so much context for our lives. It would give us purpose. If we could catch a glimpse of the true context of our lives in light of who God is, from everlasting to everlasting, we would lean in. We would align our lives with the purposes of God because we would automatically give him the reverence he's due. And that's why we do that, because here's the challenge for us. We lose sight of that during the week. We lose sight of that in all of the things that we have going on. We miss the context. And consequently, what we start to do is we try to create purpose out of things here in this life that are temporary. Money and success and pleasure and material possessions and comfort. And we start to live our lives trying to get purpose out of those things that are temporary, that go away. But if you were to focus, if you were to invite his presence into your life, if you were to catch a glimpse of how big God is, how big his grace is, how powerful God is, how vast God is, it would change everything, because the context for our finite lives is the God who always has been and always will be, the God who is from everlasting to everlasting. And to find purpose is to connect to significance, creature and creator, in a significant way. And so Moses says, if we only knew, if we could only see, if we could only open our minds to, if we could only open our eyes to who you are, how big you are, it would create the context for which our lives would find purpose in this great story. And then you could say it this way: God created you on purpose for his purpose. God has a purpose for your life. You are not an accident. You are not an afterthought. You are not a mistake. God created you on purpose for his purpose. And Moses says, it is foolish for you. Like, you might live 70 years. Some even live to 80. He goes, it is foolish for you to think in those 70 or 80 years, or however long you have, whatever time you've been given, to think that you can find purpose in this short life outside of God's everlasting story. That is a foolish thought. It's a foolish pursuit. That's why Moses says, but if we could understand how vast and how eternal and how expansive God is compared to our lives, it would change everything. And so, in light of all that, here's what Moses writes next. It's so powerful. Teach us to realize the brevity of life so that we may grow in wisdom. Teach us to realize the brevity of life so that we may grow in wisdom. Moses would say, we actually gain wisdom when we understand the context of our short lives in relation to the God who is from everlasting to everlasting. Wisdom is the ability to connect the dots in life and understand from a broad perspective how life fits together and works. And Moses says, when you recognize how brief and short your life really is, it gives you a new perspective in which you're able to see your life in the context of God's everlasting story, and you begin to live and make decisions from that perspective. It changes your priorities. In other words, Moses would say, when you realize the brevity of life, you will gain a greater understanding of the context of your life, which is God's purposes here in this world. Now, about 1,400 years later, first century, Jesus has come to this world, and God has sent Jesus into our world. And after Jesus died and rose again, a bunch of people are following Jesus in the first century, and somebody writes to, specifically, Hebrew people living in the first century. It's a document that's called the Letter to the Hebrews, or for us in our modern context, we call it the Book of Hebrews. But it's written to Hebrew people, describing to them what faith looks like in light of Jesus, and how to take the Judaism and the law of Moses and all these things and follow Jesus in their context. And as part of that, the author actually writes about Moses and writes about the decision Moses made when he gave up his rights and his privileges as, royalty and being the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and instead chooses to work as a slave with his own people. And this is what the author of Hebrews writes. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses understood something. Moses understood that God is everlasting to everlasting, that his life here on earth had a purpose. And so he understood that the purpose of his life wasn't found in the context of things here in this life. That it wasn't about privilege, and it wasn't about comfort, and it wasn't about wealth, and it wasn't about royalty. Because he saw the big picture, that the purpose of life was found in the context of God's eternal story. So what about you? Where are you finding purpose? Where are you spending your time? Because wherever you're spending your time, that's where you're spending your life. So let me give you four practical ways to make your life count. Whatever time you have, you're spending your life. And your life, consequently your time, the word life and time can be really interchanged. Your time, your life is telling a story. What's the story you want to tell? What's the story that will be told about you someday? About how you spent your time, how you spent your life. So let me give you 4 practical things that you can put into practice. Number 1, determine who is most important. Like just determine who is the most important people in my life. Here's why this matters. Because, by the way, if you're married, let me give you a hint. Your spouse is at the top of your list. If you have kids, they're at the top of your list. But here's why this matters. This is a goal for me in my life. One of my personal goals. I want the people who know me the best to love and respect me the most. Now, doing what I do, I stand on a stage and I speak to groups of people. And sometimes here's the natural dynamic that comes from that, because I share stories and, I talk to you, and it's not a lot of, talk back this way, right? This is a monologue mostly. And consequently, here's what ends up happening, that a lot of people end up knowing me better than I know them. And somewhere along the way, I just had, as a pastor, I just make this determination, years ago, I just made this conscious decision that I'd have to be okay disappointing some people who feel like they know me pretty well, because I don't want to disappoint the people who I'm closest to. And if I said yes to every invitation, if I said yes to every, here's the reality. I can't answer every single email and every single text and every single Facebook message and be the spouse I want to be, the husband I want to be the dad I want to be, and pursue every hobby I want to pursue, and be the kind of friend I want to be, and do everything I want to do. There's just not enough time in a day. So somewhere along the way, I have to say no to something so I can say yes to what's most important. So here's a question for you. At some point, your life is going to tell a story. Who is most important to you? And are you willing to say no to some people to say yes to the people that are most important? Because at the end of my life, if, there's this public persona and everybody goes, Jeremiah, and my kids don't want to be around me, then I've lost. The story I want my life to tell is, do the people who know me the best love and respect me the most? I'm willing to disappoint some other people. So who's most important? Who is most important? Then determine this. Determine what is most important. Like, there's some things that I want to accomplish. There's some things I want to do. There's some things that in my life story, I hope that I can say this, I was able to do this and I was able to do that, but you can't say yes to everything, right? You got to pick and choose. You got to prioritize. So what are some things that you hope at the end of your life will be said, like, this is what they were able to do? What is that thing for you? Because you can't say yes to everything. So you got to prioritize and go, okay, what am I gonna say yes to? What is most important for me to give my time to and to give my life to? And then number 3, determine your role in God's kingdom. See, you have a purpose. Life is connected to the context of God's eternal story. So your life has significance, and you were created with a role to play. We all have a part to play. I happen to be a pastor. Some of you are great teachers. Some of you make a lot of money and finance things that move God's kingdom forward. Some of you are behind the scenes and making things happen and spreading the message of God's love. Some of you are incredible neighbors and friends and coworkers, and we all have a different role to play, but we all have a significant role to play. So what is it that God has created you to do in his kingdom? What is your role? Wisdom would suggest that you spend some time discovering that you spend some time figuring out what is my contribution to God's kingdom. So determine who is most important, determine what's most important, determine your role in God's kingdom, and then commit your time to those things. Commit your time to those things, or commit your life to those things. Because every yes is a no to something. You notice that? The only way that you can say yes to this is if you say no to something else. So what are the things that you're going to give your priorities to? And this is super important. Managing your time well is less about developing the skills to keep all the plates spinning. And it's a lot more about developing the discipline to let some of them drop. What do you have to say no to so you can say yes to those things that are most important? Determine who's the most important. Determine what's the most important. Determine your role in God's kingdom, and then give your time, commit your life to those things, and your life will take on purpose in God's everlasting story. It's a story that began when God created human beings for a loving community. And the story of humanity is that every one of us, from the first human beings to every one of us today, said, God, thanks, but no thanks, I got this. I'll live life my own way. And as a result, it caused brokenness in our lives and brokenness between us and God and us and each other. And we know that from our own experiences, and that's why God sent Jesus into this world, that Jesus would come in, that he would restore the brokenness, that he would show us what God is like and show us the way to live. And the ultimate expression of love, he would allow himself to be put to death, his body laid in a tomb, and according to multiple eyewitness accounts, hundreds of eyewitnesses said, no, Jesus rose from the dead. That means there's more to this life than this life, and you and I have been invited to be a part of God's family. If you've never said yes to that invitation, I want to invite you. This is the purpose of our life, to coexist in community with God and each other, and that we find purpose in our lives in that context. So if you've never said yes to that, you can say yes by just agreeing with this simple prayer. God, please forgive my sins. Forgive me for the times that I've walked away from you, and I'm so grateful you never walk away from me. Thank you for pursuing me with your love. Now, I want to say yes to your invitation. Make me your son, make me your daughter. And help me to put my trust in you, to follow you and your wisdom and your way of living life as best as I know how from this moment on. I pray this in your name. Amen.